Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 10, I believe it is. 11. Okay, sorry. I've lost my count since we took a week off for Easter. Not all of us are religious, but I was in Singapore. Tim was, like everyone else was busy doing their own things with family.
I don't think it's a proper taking liberties if we don't get the episode number wrong or have some sort of confusion about it. I think it's become our whole
Sure. It's become our shtick. So, just to quickly introduce everyone, that was Lee over in West Australia.
Go on.
That was Lee. Sorry, that's Lee in West Australia. The person that I rudely interrupted there was Zeev in. Are you still in Melbourne or?
Yes, I appear to be in Melbourne.
Okay. Yeah, and we've got Tim also over in Victoria. So this week we've got basically the Panama Papers, the federalism and subsidiarity, and well, if we have time, there's going to be a throwdown between Tim and Lee on Invasion Day Mark II. So let's make sure we get there, right? Okay, so let's start with the Panama Papers.
I'm not sure how that will happen over the internet, but I'm looking forward to it already. Go on.
Sure. So the Panama Papers, in case nobody, if you've been living under a rock, basically the biggest leaks, well, the biggest unraveling of legal documents since, I would
Probably
hesitate to say WikiLeaks. Yeah, since Snowden, yeah, has come out, and it's basically about a law firm in Panama which is engaged in creating shelf companies for basically companies around the world to help with tax minimization, tax avoidance, and in some case corruption, because like the Prime Minister of Iceland has been implicated in some of these activities. Now the law firm says that these are perfectly legal. They are in some countries, and yeah, I guess we just have a lot to talk about because from the perspective of crony capitalism to how free markets and companies should operate. I guess in an ethical fashion. So I'll throw it open for everyone to talk about.
So I think there's three issues. Firstly, there is the question of how much of this is actually legitimate, and sort of like basically tax evasion. Secondly, there is actually, I think, questions of genuine corruption, especially around Russian oligarchs, and there's some stuff in terms where it may not have been illegal, but people like the Prime Minister of Iceland might have put all these companies in his wife's name and he didn't declare it before Parliament. So there's stuff like that. And then I think the third point is essentially this is going to be the rallying point for the left, particularly when it comes to, making corporations pay more money. I mean, we've had a lot of that, your Buffett tax, and you've got stuff to do with Apple and Google, multinationals, and you've got like your your Oxfams and your various kind of left-wing charities and NGOs crying poor and saying we need to go after these corporations. And I think this is going to be the lightning rod for them, if it ever will be, with public generation.
My basic principle when I first heard about this scandal was there's nothing morally wrong with tax avoidance or tax minimization. So my initial reaction is if they're avoiding tax, good on them. I mean, everyone tries to avoid as much tax as possible. There's the famous Kerry Packer quote where he says, well, everybody tries to minimize their tax, and I would would pay more if you guys didn't waste it all the time. So yeah, it's not much of a scandal in my mind. The only thing I'm concerned about if fraud against other companies has been committed.
Yes, and that's primarily where I come from as well. The issue is, where fraud has occurred, where basically someone who has someone like through the political process has created these shelf companies to cover up the fact that there's a favorable bid going to something that they own stock in which case basically, say if it's a nationalized entity or something like that, a formerly nationalized entity which is being privatized, and all of a sudden, say the Prime Minister of Iceland or Prime Minister of named country here benefits personally. I think it feeds into the entire idea of corruption through privatization, which is bad because we want to try and privatize more things. Yes, and like Lee said, it's going to be the rallying cry of leftists that want to show, hey, here is corporate greed. Here's a good example of corporate greed. And it all occurs because we don't allow them not to pay their full fair share of taxes.
And
Yeah.
certainly, I mean, like if you because the Guardian, they've got a live feed of all the different things, and they've got all these sort of because it's like a blog, and they've basically got all these posts which talk about other media organizations who have picked up on this story, and they're showing the graphics and the headlines, and it's like dirty little secrets. It's a parallel universe for the ultra rich and ultra powerful, but a massive new leak has exposed their underworld. Like, the whole way they're framing this. And I think this will be similar across the whole left. Is there's something dirty and filthy about what they're doing here in minimising the attacks, and we must stop it. And certainly the way politicians have responded, like David Cameron, he's come out and sort of talked a bit about this, and you got Scott Morrison saying how the ATO is going to investigate all this stuff. This is really just hounding people, like demonising potential. I mean, in some cases, a lot of it's going to be legitimate activity, and it's just adding to the overall kind of how to describe. Basically, it's adding towards the rhetoric against rich people keeping their own money, which is.
Well, this is why there was the idea in Piketty's book for a global wealth tax. I mean, this is what will be back on the agenda, as you hinted before, Lee. That it's so terrible that there's all these low taxing countries that companies are able to move to. So this is what's coming next.
I'm actually not that bad with a global wealth tax. Effectively, that would just be a giant sales tax, like a global sales tax.
70% income tax for the world.
It wouldn't be. I doubt they'd get a 70% income tax on the world.
That's what Piketty is.
And if he's suggesting that, I don't think he understands the concept of a wealth tax. The only thing that could ever be a wealth tax is a sales tax, essentially a consumption tax. Income taxes can never be a wealth tax because income is basically it's always the same thing. It's money made minus it's revenue minus expenses. Yeah.
Income and wealth aren't the same thing. Warren Buffett may earn, in income terms, a few $1 million a year or some millions of dollars a year, but as a billionaire, in real terms, his assets are much larger. Income tax doesn't actually reflect that. His assets far exceed his income.
Which is why an income tax can never be a wealth tax. And if Piketty has suggested that, he needs to hand in his. I think he has a strong case to sue whoever gave him his PhD because he clearly fails to understand the distinction between income and wealth. Just saying. In fact, I think that statement alone.
I think that if there's anything that this controversy demonstrates, it's that people don't like paying tax. And I guess the inevitable response that we should give when people don't like paying tax is, well, maybe if they paid less tax here, that's where their money would be. And
yes,
that's where their money would be invested. And we would benefit from that investment here if our taxes were lower. Why do we need to get in such a fuss about it? It's just human nature.
Because we all need to suffer together. That's what some people think.
We all suffer together, yes. But the lower our taxes are, the more of these funds will be invested here, and the more we will benefit. And surely, the more tax revenue there may be for those interested in raising tax revenue, surely that is a profoundly good outcome. Not that I'm one of those people, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but speaking of tax competitiveness, it was a bit of a brain fart that Malcolm Turnbull brought up last week with the idea of basically reducing the federal income tax by a small amount and allowing the states to compete on whether to keep, how much of that tax for healthcare and education. The idea being that states would compete, we would get a little bit of competitive federalism through the income tax system by giving the states piecemeal parts of income tax back. So yes, competitive
I'm not
federalism.
even sure that that was his idea at all, to be honest with you, because, I mean, Blind Freddy could see that the states would oppose it, and anyone can see that that would create a political furor of an amazing kind. Now, of course, if Turnbull were really minded to prosecute any kind of a reform agenda and actually sustain political attacks for a long-term agenda, then yeah, I think
Is this connection dead?
It might be. I was wondering if it was me. Okay.
Wow, that's unfortunate.
I'll continue on. That basically the reason why this idea didn't get up is because basically the state governments like the arrangement of spending all the money and getting all the popularity that comes from spending, but they don't want any of the political pain of having to actually tax people and then have the political pain of that. So of course the states love the current arrangement of just getting the begging bowl out to the federal government. I mean,
Yeah, so no, I agree with that, but I actually thought, see, I had a lot of friends who were talking about, how we want competitive federalism. Even if this is a small step, we should take this as a small step and try to push in, sort of expand the framework and, basically eventually give the entire income tax back to the states. Now, I don't think that would ever work. Because we've seen what it looks like when states have competitive taxation powers. So the wholesale sales tax was the thing that the GST replaced. And the tax burden around the country when the WST's regime was there run by each state, we paid more tax. We paid more sales tax. One of the ways John Howard was able to get the GST across the line was by telling people, yes, you're going to have a nationalized GST, goods and services tax, but it'll be uniform, 10% everywhere, and your tax, overall tax that you pay will come down. Now, they made this appealing to the states by promising them more state grants. So while the sales tax revenue, initially the sales tax revenue was lower, now it's actually gone higher. It's actually a really good example of what happens when you drop taxes on something like consumption taxes, because over time it obviously increases. But
the reality about the sales taxes, the state sales taxes, though, is it's filling in the hole that the income taxes would have been better. Basically, it filled the void that the income taxes.
No.
So,
my point was to basically say that the states have always operated as cartels, and it's because we can't have competitive federalism like the United States has for two reasons. Firstly, our states are too fucking large. The main incentive for when individuals leave states is geographic distances between cities. The geographic distance between cities in Australia is massive. Like the distance between Sydney and Melbourne is 890 kilometers, right? Or the closest one, Sydney and Canberra, that's 290 kilometers. That's the point at which you would change jurisdiction. On top of that, you have the fact that every state has really large stamp duties. Instead of land taxes, they opt for stamp duty. So there's a high transfer cost as you leave. The third thing is jobs. You're targeting income tax here, not corporate taxes, right? Companies are likely to move based on corporate taxes. Companies are not likely to move based on changes to income tax. All this proposal would do is what?
There has been an episode in Australian history where competitive federalism has worked when Queensland abolished death duties in the early 70s, and therefore that encouraged all the other states to follow suit. So it has worked before, albeit not as often.
Albeit, in that case, it was a very unpopular tax that was on its way out anyway.
Yeah, but they still have it in America.
They still have it in America
which is the federal tax.
Which is a federal tax, yeah. Yeah. So whenever people point out to like that, I'm just like, well, it was an unpopular tax that was on its last legs. Because keep in mind, the big problem with debt duties in Australia, debt duties in America do not kick in until $5 million, right? Debt duties in Australia, because they didn't adjust for bracket creep, started hitting the middle class. right? That's why it was unpopular. That's why it died, right? It had nothing to freaking do with competitive federalism. All it was because middle-class people like to give stuff to their kids without losing half of it. It just goes to prove people hate paying taxes. If the states had debt duties exactly like they have in America, which is indexed and only catching like the very richest people in the country, you would still have debt duties in this country. So it's not an issue of competitive federalism winning; it's an issue of people not paying taxes, which I think is actually a really good example of why more people should pay taxes. Because the more people that pay taxes, the lower the tax rates come.
So we hope. Or
No,
maybe-
no, they always no. Everywhere. So if you take a look at it, Russia has a flat tax. It is 13%. It's 13% on the poorest person. It's 13% on the richest person. How hard do you think it is for them to raise that 13% tax? Hell, look at our GST. How hard is it to raise the GST? Broad-based taxes are almost impossible to raise. And I say almost impossible because you have to make a very compelling democratic case to do it.
I mean, I think the real politics situation of this just baffles. Well, I understand why it's there, but it still amuses me, I should say, rather than baffles. So essentially, Turnbull backed down because he didn't get the permission of the states. He doesn't need the permission of the states to this. I mean, that's the whole thing about this whole scenario is that the federal government has monopolized income tax. They could unilaterally just say, we're getting rid of the income tax. We're gonna get rid of that ban on. Well, it's not even a ban. They essentially changed the rules around income tax to make it like it was before 1940, whatever, and just eliminate the departments that are there to service the state's interests, which are, say, education and health and whatnot, and then just go, states, do whatever you want. But the reality is, it's the politics is what's stopping this from happening in a major way, which is disheartening. I mean, it certainly wasn't helped by. I'm sorry.
What if he was just doing this for a soundbite in the election? Well, I tried.
Oh, no. There's no doubt that that's what he was doing.
Yeah, and let's face it, that Turnbull doesn't have the guts to actually follow through with this idea, because what would be the next step is starving the state of health and education funding, and of course there's no way he's going to do that for political reasons. So it was just sort of, I think, an idea he threw out to say, oh, here's a big idea, but I can't do anything about it. So
yeah, but it makes him look stupid because he did it for 2 days.
The way for him to blame the states, although the disadvantage is that he gets a bit of flack for floating an idea which goes nowhere.
But I was also going to say the proposal that he'd put forward would actually be the most expensive system known to Australia of how to do income tax collection, because you would have to have about 7 equivalents of the ATO running in each state.
According to his proposal, first of all, state revenue offices already exist. Second of all, what his proposal is, the ATO would continue to collect income tax and assess it.
And they just give it back as state grants.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Then fine. That's in which case I'd just say, what the fuck is the difference between that and state grants? You can already do that, and that takes no effort on your part.
Setting the income tax levels as they choose, and in turn people compete within jurisdictions for.
But I already explained why. We have the phenomena of state cartel behavior, and why it doesn't work here in this country. I mean, it could work if we had more, more states. Effectively, if we smashed New South Wales up into 5 states, if we smashed Queensland up into 2 states, if we smashed Victoria up into 3 states, it might work.
Except that the problem with that is there's just not the population to make that viable, unless you divided Sydney up into 5 states in and of itself.
No, I would divide Sydney up into 3 states.
Yeah, okay. Because, Western Australia, there's essentially everybody lives in Perth, and there's, not even 500,000 people who live outside of Perth. It's just, there's no way, with all this land mass, you can't turn it into any other viable state.
Yeah, no,
it's Reinhardt land, and then the rest.
No.
Friend.
So I've actually had this discussion with friends before, and I've shown how I would divide it. Basically, what I would do is I would take the southeastern components of Sydney, and basically everything east of Burwood, and everything south of that, and basically creates a state called Illawarra, and that would go all the way down to Nowra. Up on the north side, you'd have the bridge going out to about Epping, and everything north of that up until Newcastle would be called the Central Coast. And then basically Western Sydney would become its own territory because fuck giving them 12 senators. Yeah.
Well, we did take one step towards creating more states with the talk that North Queensland might want to become its own state. So your crazy ideas might one day be viable.
I was gonna split Queensland into Queensland and Capricornia in honor of that Daily Mail article. Yeah, but anyway, we should probably move on to the next topic, which is your epic duel of
Oh,
Invasion.
yes. We should explain the context of it.
Okay, yeah. So I'm actually going to let the two of you explain this out, and Zeev and I are just going to sit and watch.
So the context of this is that the Daily Telegraph had a front story which talked about how I think it was University of Sydney teaching uni students that Australia was. University of New South Wales was teaching students that Australia was invaded, not settled, and so this set off another episode in the history wars. Lee posted on Facebook that, well, technically it was invaded, and I disagreed and say no, Australia was settled because you couldn't call what was there beforehand a civilization.
Okay, all right. So, the specific context was actually, I think it's Matthew Lesh from the Institute of Public Affairs, basically taking the side of the Daily Telegraph and saying it wasn't an invasion. And my point was essentially, well, what else do you call a situation where a bunch of people come along, take people's land, abolish their political institutions, and essentially subsume them into their own political situation? Well, that's an invasion. There is no other way to describe that. If the situation was that they came along, they set up trading posts, they traded with the Aboriginals, they respected the Aboriginals' land, and they only lived in places where people weren't living already, that would be genuine, proper, full-on colonization. But the situation was essentially they came in and said, this is not owned by anybody, all these black fellas are now belong to us, and we're going to divvy up the land as we see fit. And that is an invasion.
To be fair, we did correct that mistake in 1992.
Well, it's probably a bit late, and certainly we haven't given back the political autonomy to Aboriginals to decide what they want to do for themselves. But if Indonesia did that to us, we would call it an invasion.
But the thing is, though, my point was that, oh my God, that, the settlers of this country didn't adhere to strict, libertarian principles. Oh my God, throw me down. No settlement has ever been perfectly libertarian, and you're implying that the Aboriginal community that was there beforehand was a libertopia, which it wasn't. I mean, there wasn't.
Whoa, actually, no, I never heard him say that it was liberto. Yeah.
No,
He said, okay, no. You don't have to be in Libertopia to have property rights.
Yeah.
But there was no civilization before.
Yes, there was.
Australia.
Let me give you a list of criteria.
Civilization, you want to call it something else? There were people there, Tim.
Yeah.
There were people there. They used the land as they chose. The reality is that by any libertarian definition, the use of that land would fall into some manner of property right. And just taking it away by force is, yes, an assault. Yeah. That's what it is, Tim.
Just to go to that point of civilization, because I think it was Paul McCarthy, who's actually the CEO of the Mancow Foundation in WA, he said, he essentially said terra nullius, right? And he said there's no civilization. Okay, what do you call something which has religion, has the cultivation of land, has complex interpersonal tribal relationships, has
borders.
Borders? How is that not civilization? You know, how are all those things
Most of
not civilization?
most of the land was unsettled, so there was plenty of land, and there was some negotiation
that.
between the settlers and the indigenous population. Yes, there were conflicts. There was a lot of bad things that were happened, but there has been steps to correct it in the past 100 years, and I would argue that because of the white settlement in Australia, we're a better country today than if the settlement had never occurred.
Okay.
Well, that's engaging.
That's just a utilitarian argument.
With Lee's observation, like I'm grateful that I'm here, but the fact of the matter is that people got here by violent means.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that Australia is an awful dictatorship, dystopic hellhole. It just means that bad things happened in the past, and we should recognise that, learn from it.
And it wasn't as if it wasn't as if the settlers brought nothing with them. I mean, they brought with them advanced methods of living. Yes, obviously. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, some Aboriginals suffered, but on the whole, over the time, the settlement has led to a better society than what would have occurred.
Well,
But Lee hasn't actually made a value judgment though. That's the point you seem to be ignoring.
Yeah,
He simply stated that what happened was an invasion.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, we should point out. Okay, you can say overall, for some people it is better. For the people who were killed, who were murdered, the people who were enslaved, which actually happened. Like, it may not have happened. It may not have been Auschwitz, but it was still a thing. It still actually really happened. Most Aboriginals who died as a result of Europeans coming, or the British coming to Australia, died because of disease. That's going to happen anytime a new land is, interacts people from outside. It would have happened whether they traded, would have happened whether it was invaded. But the reality was, I think it's 20,000 Aboriginals were killed in wars. Like, they actually waged, they defended their lands, and they essentially were massacred because they did not have guns and we had guns. And I mean, essentially, that's the only reason why the Aboriginals weren't able to hold off foreigners, is because we had better technology. And a bit like the conquistadors in Spain, when you're on the losing side of that equation, it's not much fun. And yeah, so if you want to say overall their benefit, yeah, sure, maybe. But the reality is, people still died, people's land were taken, people's political autonomy was stripped from them. And you can't just say, well, just because some people now are better off, that justifies doing those things. Certainly not in any natural rights formulation. Do libertarians accept that? And certainly, if we apply that to, say, the nanny state, or we assign that to any form of authoritarian political thing, who all make the promise that will make the world better, libertarians on the straight will say, well, no, you don't get to violate people's rights just because you think you can make a better world.
I completely agree. Well said, Lee.
The point that I was basically making was that yes, of course, all throughout history, individual rights haven't been respected. But I think
But that's not a good reason not to respect them.
I'm saying that we shouldn't view. My overall point was that we shouldn't view Australia, the formation of what is modern day Australia, as some accumulation of shameful events, which is what Lee implied. I thought.
Part of the story, Lee.
Yeah,
I mean, sorry, Tim. Part of the story.
Yeah.
Part of the story is that Australian society embraced certain Anglo-Saxon legal norms that allowed people to live more or less freely amongst themselves. Part of the story is that a lot of bloodshed happened, and we need to be upfront about that. Yeah. There's nothing gained to say
I actually, I agree with that. I mean, this is a matter of history that we're talking about. It's not, hey, we're better off now, so let's forget about that all happening. I'm sorry, that's not how it works.
It's not a matter of forgetting about it. It's also recognizing that, yes, there was a lot of good that happened with white settlement as well, and that overall it has been better. Yes, there have been some bad things, but I don't think that we should take the black, as it's called, the black armband view of history and say that this country which we like living in is built on rape and pillage.
I don't think anyone here. Well, that might be the case for some people.
Like, the reality. Sorry,
most countries are. Most borders are built to some extent on village assault.
So you would say that that the American settlers stole lands from the Indians as well?
In some cases,
they
yes.
Absolutely did. If you look at the trail of
No.
they treated them
Lee,
terrible things to the American Indians.
Yeah, I agree, Lee. You got to be careful though. In some cases, they bought land. So, I make a prediction.
I have no problem with that. But I mean, and it's most of these circumstances. Like in any situation back in that time, if you had more guns, you could do what you want, and that's what happened. But I mean, I don't essentially, if we want to move Indigenous rights, the notion of Indigenous rights and the notion of Aboriginal dignity to a place where libertarian principles and particularly natural rights can have a place, I don't think you can get to that world without actually acknowledging the reality of the situation. So I have a real problem when the guys of the IPA take a stance in the culture wars on the conservative side and say, well, it wasn't an invasion, when under your own principles it is. Like it is indisputable that it was an invasion under any natural rights framework. And so I think we have to, if we want to go to that place where we can say Aboriginals have the right and dignity to determine their own future on their own land, and that the government shouldn't intervene in their lives, you have to get to the point where you say what happened was an invasion, because that's essentially a consistent application of those principles.
But how are they not equal today? Like that's another one of my points. How are they not equal today, Aboriginal people?
I think we're conflating a large number of things here. Now, I kind of agree with... Well, no, I don't agree with you entirely. So, they don't have proper property rights on their sovereign territory.
Yep.
Right? Limited hunting...
That's because of what the left's imposed on them. That's not because of... that doesn't adhere to natural rights.
Well, that doesn't matter. We should be arguing for them to have natural rights, right?
Yeah, I don't dispute that as well. I'm saying that that's not something the right's done. That's something that's the left.
I don't care what the right and left does. I legitimately don't care. I don't care if the right did it or the left did it. I'm saying, from a natural rights perspective, we should be arguing for these things for Aboriginal.
And I agree with that as well.
Yeah.
Well, actually, paternalism towards Aboriginals has been a bipartisan policy for probably as long, it's in the last 100 years. Like, I'm not aware of any politician that's come out and said we should give them back their land, we should give them back political autonomy. I mean, if you want to talk seriously about natural rights, those two things go hand in hand, because essentially what happened when the Brits came is they said all of these tribal organisations are just outright abolished, and you are now subject to the British state, and then as a result, the Australian state. And so
today we.
By the way,
have to trace back property rights 250 years to make it right.
One second. We are actually over time, but I'm going to continue this for another 8 minutes or so, because this is actually going well. Yeah. Okay.
What I would say about political autonomy is that that is a step too far. Political autonomy is something that none of us really have, and to give it to a bunch of tribes is there's no tribes to give it to anymore, frankly, and any tribe that gets it is it's a fiction, and frankly, I mean, even if the tribes genuinely existed on the same terms as they once did, why should they have political autonomy? I mean, what would be the result? Why are we convinced that it would be any better than what we have today?
They're able to vote in elections today. I mean, they're part of the Australian Constitution that said they weren't citizens. That was deleted in 1967 with 91% vote. I mean, so we have corrected a lot of the wrongs. And Lee, are you saying that, like I said before, that we should go back in time 250 years and work out who gets what land back that we should revert? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, no, not quite. So essentially, I think that land that was taken should be compensated on just terms, just like any other Commonwealth, appropriation of land. I think if there's lands that are essentially Crown land, they should just be given back to the tribes. Now, I mean, how you actually say who is the tribe or not, I mean, that's obviously a difficult question. Maybe it's an insoluble question. I mean, I'm not going to sort of argue the specifics of that, because it's just, I mean, it's too difficult.
Also-
Certainly in this format to talk about it, but certainly we should, if there is land that we can say this was Aboriginal land, it should be given back to that tribe, however you define that. Now, as opposed to the notion of political autonomy, essentially, if you believe in the notion of essentially self-determination, that is, I own myself, I own my property. Well, going back before white settlements, they were essentially a bunch of autonomous political units. And
There was no,
I think
and
no,
there was no country
actually,
though. It was a series of
Yes.
tribes.
sure, but
there was a
those
series of
political
no. There were a series of countries.
Sure.
They met the definition of countries,
Yeah.
right? This was decided in Mabo, Tim. This has already been decided. They were countries,
units. Okay, then I'll
Okay.
say countries.
but yeah,
Mabo
yeah,
did say countries, but more or less, let's agree with that. Go on.
Sure. So I mean, like the notion is essentially that, like, I don't think you can just say. I don't think the British Crown can come in and just declare itself sovereign over a bunch of autonomous political authorities. They were countries. You can't. Like to say that it's acceptable is to say, like, I mean, that's just. Well, certainly it's not acceptable in any form of foreign affairs now. I mean. Essentially, that's what happened in Crimea.
I mean, it's still
by the Russians.
well,
Nobody
it's still
really
the-
liked
it's-
that either. So.
it's also the major source of headache in the Middle East.
Yeah.
We've got
Should
people
we-
who don't
should we-
accept the existence of countries.
Sure. So
How far do we take that principle, Lee? I mean, should the UK be for the Celts? I mean,
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah.
so
stop.
so yeah, I kind of want to tack onto this.
Do we have a stable system of property rights? I don't really
So-
care who enforces it. Do we have a stable system of property rights? I don't really care flag
what
up top says or what the banner, whether it's a yellow sun with a black and red, or whether it's a 5 stars and a British ensign flag or what have you. Do we have a stable
But the
system
thing
of
is,
property
Steve,
rights?
you're not an
Huh?
Aboriginal, so it's really not about you. It's about them and what they want to do. And if they
Well-
want to stay part of Australia, and that's fine. If they want to stay part of Australia, I have no problem with that. It's actually giving them the choice.
By all means.
Yeah. So
So it's
I just want to tack in here. I actually don't think this is so. I think I might agree with Steve on this. It's not about making good. It's about guaranteeing political equality, and I think political autonomy might actually be a step too far in that framework, considering we ourselves don't have the same level of political autonomy as we're purporting to say we should grant the Aboriginals. Now, under a natural rights framework, I actually agree with you, Lee, that we should be heading towards making good.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Steve.
My house, as having seceded from the Commonwealth as of today, and you are all my witnesses to that proclamation.
I would be okay with that. I'm
That's all I'm saying.
like I'm not saying it shouldn't be like if we want to make it an option for everybody else, I'm okay with that as well. But I think there's definitely a strong case to say that it was illegitimate for the British Crown to unilaterally declare sovereignty over this entire territory, the entire continent of Australia, and to just essentially abolish any other every other country that was within it. And I think that's like if we really want to go undo the damage that was done in the invasion of Australia, we have to come to terms with the fact that Aboriginals need to be able to determine their own future, and that might not be within
With
Australia.
everyone else.
That's
Along with
fine.
everyone else.
If they want to leave, if they want to have on their own land, have their own countries, I'm okay with that. I mean, certainly there's no sense that they're going to be some sort of military threat. You know, like essentially we've got there's very large territories with a very small amount of people. When we look at the current organisation of Aboriginal self-determination, which is not really self-determination at all. There's certainly no military threat.
Going to declare Herodistan anytime soon.
So because somebody who ancestors were here 1,000 years ago, they're allowed to have a greater say on the future of this country than somebody whose ancestors were here 250 years ago. I mean, what difference does it make today if we're equal citizens?
Should be free to secede.
Hang on.
Well,
Let Lee make his point.
No. There was never
As I understand.
the Brits never had the right to strip them strip Aboriginals of their political autonomy ever. That was completely legitimate, and it could be, 10 years after the fact, it could be 250 years after, it could be 1,000 years after the fact. The reality is that the Brits never had the right to do it to Aboriginals in the first place, and so to say that they are somehow different from us, well, yeah, they are, because they essentially had their autonomy stripped from them. Now, if we want to talk about other scenarios, we could talk about other scenarios. If we want to talk about whether the Celts and, Northern Ireland's a great example of, we're talking about, the people making self-determination, Scotland, the Falkland Islands, there's lots of examples, even within the Brits, in the British, United Kingdom, where we could talk about, well, how does this come through? But in the Australian context,
rather than engaging in a historical debate about which ethnicity got where first, let's just put it this way. There are property owners throughout Australia. Each of them should, in principle, be allowed to secede from the Commonwealth at any point. The end.
Yeah. I can agree with that.
I just think we can't have real reconciliation. We can't really undo the injustice.
But I think, you're getting into dangerous
without
territory.
coming to terms with this question.
You're getting into dangerous territory when you say that because somebody is of Aboriginal descent, they get to have a greater say than somebody who's white just because of who their ancestors were.
So
can we pause there? Listen, Tim, just everyone who owns any given property in Australia should, in principle, be allowed to say, I secede from the Australian Commonwealth tomorrow.
Of course. I like that idea.
Excellent. So you're both
we have consensus.
Disagree about.
Right, we have consensus, and with that,
we are both agreed.
Libertarians agree. Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, it took us a while to get there, but we finally got consensus. And with that, I'm going to end this show. So that was episode 10. I gave you 10 extra minutes.
11.
So 11 extra minutes. Sorry, I can't count.
Episode 11.
So, it's also with 11 extra minutes. There you go. So. All right, episode 11 with 11 extra minutes, now ending. So, bye.
See you.
Bye.